Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Campbell Davis. I am the voluntary sector lead for the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's very nice to have you all here. I was very much enjoying the chat as we were waiting to start with where everybody's joining from. I can say I'm joining from a very wet Hertfordshire, just to add to the chat of earlier, we're very pleased to have you all here today. So just a couple of housekeeping rules. Obviously the panel will be on video all the way through. If for any reason any of us drop out, we will just continue and hope that internet connections resurface. But it's similarly, if you have any problems hearing us or anything, please do put it in the chat. And our colleagues from Charities Digital will be happy to assist, I'm sure. So this is the last NCSC webinar of the year with Charities Digital. We're very pleased to be joined in a slightly different format by a host of expert speakers from across the voluntary sector. We're going to be talking through the impact 2020 has had on digital, on cybersecurity and on fraud. And then we'll be looking ahead to what 2021 is likely to bring. I know a lot of people are certainly just waiting for January and hoping to get into 2021 in the hope it will be a better year. And also just talking through what you within your own charities can do to prepare for what we might face in 2021. We'll be taking questions through the session, so please do use the Q&A function. It's there and available for you to use. We'll begin actually answering the Q&A at the end, but please do put them in as we go. There's plenty of time at the end to cover as many questions as we possibly can. So that's what we're going to cover today. I'm very pleased to be joined by today's panel. We'll go to each of them in turn in a second to introduce themselves. Just a couple of restrictions first. Obviously, each of the speakers will have their own restrictions and commercial sensitivities about different platforms, and in the case of the regulator, obviously, individual cases that they're handling. So we won't be able to answer any of those kinds of questions in the Q&A at the end. So, you know, in terms of sort of specific platforms that we might use or our views on individual kind of pieces of technology. But where we can, we will obviously answer all of your questions. So just bear that in mind. So without further ado, I'd like to first turn to Julia, who's the Information Security and Risk Compliance Manager at Marie Curie, to introduce herself and her experience.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Cab. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today. I'm also joining from a cold and wet London today. I'm Information Security, Risk and Compliance Manager at Marie Curie. I've been with the organisation for 2 years. Just a quick intro to Marie Curie for those that aren't familiar. We provide care and support for people with terminal illness and their families, and we do this with we run 9 hospices across the UK. We also have our nursing service. Nurses go out into the community and provide care and support to people in their homes. So we also have a huge fundraising operation and a back office function to support our core work of caring. So we're a complex and we're geographically dispersed organisation. And my role is within the Information Governance and Security team, which is based in London. And I work very closely with procurement, with the legal team and the DPO. And it's our role to make sure that the information that's needed by the fundraisers and the nurses is there when they need it, so it's available, and to make sure that it's accurate, and then to make sure that we're only using it securely, legally, and also ethically. And that's me.
Thank you, Julia. Very nice to have you on today. So next turn to Mia Campbell, who's head of fraud advisory panel.
Thanks, Cub, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to join you today. So my name's Mia Campbell and I'm head of the Counter Fraud Charity Fraud Advisory Panel, and our role is essentially to raise awareness of fraud and financial crime and to educate businesses, charities and individuals about the safeguards that can be put in place to manage the risk. As a membership body, we also act as a collective and independent voice of the counter fraud community in the UK and also abroad. We're also a small charity ourselves, and so as part of that, we're keenly aware of the challenges that charities of all sizes can face in managing the risk of fraud, and have always taken an active interest in trying to do what we can to support the sector. And as part of that, over the past 5 years, we've worked very closely with Alan and his colleagues at the Charity Commission to coordinate and also co-lead the Charity Fraud Awareness Week, which takes place every October. And that's it from me, so I'll hand back over to Cub.
Thanks, Mia. And finally, introduce you to Alan Bryce, who's Head of Counter Fraud and Cybercrime at the Charity Commission for England and Wales.
Thanks, Cub, and good afternoon, everyone. As you heard there, my name is Alan Bryce. I'm the Head of Counter Fraud at the Charity Commission, covering counter fraud and cybercrime. So we regulate some 170,000 English and Welsh charities. In terms of my specific role, I work with partners such as Fraud Advisory Panel and NCSC to help make the entire charity sector more resilient to both fraud and cybercrime. In that context, what have we done in terms of our regulatory role and our partnership role? Well, as you heard there, things such as the International Charity Fraud Awareness Week that we've run very successfully for 5 years, and we bring together a number of partners around that, but in particular for the advisory panel. In terms of other outputs we have that perhaps Cub will be helpful to inform our discussions. So, for example, last year, again with Fraud Advisory Panel, we undertook what we believe to be the largest ever worldwide piece of research on charity-specific fraud or cybercrime, and published 2 national reports that, again, I'll refer to perhaps if it's relevant to the sort of questions we're going to get. So around preventing charity fraud and preventing cybercrime, and that gives us the sort of insights to understand what is happening more widely across the sector. I also chair the Charities Against Fraud Partnership, which we have some 40 plus leading charities or charities professional representative bodies all coming together to share good practice and work together. And in terms of my own personal background, so I was formerly head of counter fraud at the Audit Commission, so local government counter fraud. I'm formerly an external auditor and police officer, and I have a master's in counter fraud and counter corruption. So it'd be interesting to see where the questions go, Cub. Happy to discuss them from a regulatory, law enforcement, or just academic standpoint. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Alan. So that's our panel today. We also, as you probably see on your screen, have a couple of people in the background from Charities Digital who are helping to coordinate the Q&A as we go. I think just as a scene setter for today's setting, 2020 by anyone's standards has been a pretty awful year for the country and obviously more broadly worldwide. But it's also seen one of the biggest shifts in technology and the way that we use it, if not the biggest since the invention of the internet. And with that, at NCSC, we've seen not necessarily the risks changing, but people's appreciation of those change as we've moved to home working, potentially people having not been into the office since the beginning of March. So I just want to kind of set a little bit of a scene of what we've seen within NCSC this year, and then pass on to our fellow panelists to give their perspectives from their own organisations. So within NCSC, we've seen obviously an enormous shift to home working, and with that in itself comes a set of risks that most people probably weren't as exposed to when they were predominantly based in offices. So by that, I'm kind of thinking of the shifts to people needing to work from home very quickly, the availability of corporately provided devices not being there. So bring your own device became an increasingly big issue for a number of organisations and how they manage that securely. We've also seen obviously a need to just get the job done at times. I know certainly from our perspective at the beginning of COVID, there was this just desire to just keep going, get on with it, and kind of cover off all of the admin and the corporate stuff later. And we saw that in a lot of organisations, and it was a necessary approach at the beginning of lockdown. We produced to aid organisations with this quite early on in the pandemic, some guidance called Physical to Digital, moving your organisation online, and we'll make sure links are available to that afterwards. But that talks through the kind of steps that organisations needed to take this year to make sure that in moving from a physical workspace to a much more digital one where people are working almost entirely virtually, and how to mitigate the security risks of that. So we've seen obviously a lot of that this year, and I think probably most people on this call will recognise some of the things that we talked about there. In terms of types of cybercrime we've seen through 2020, it would be, I think, remiss to not make the biggest bit the kind of rise of ransomware or awareness of ransomware. We're not as a whole seeing any more significant numbers of cybercrime than we did pre-pandemic, but what we're seeing is the pandemic being used as a hook for that, and the risk of organizations suffering from ransomware hasn't necessarily gone up in terms of the likelihood, but the impact of an attack like that became increasingly important, because where organizations perhaps previously were in an office, and actually if an organization got ransomware, yes, it's bad, it's not a good thing to have anyway, but because you're in an office, you can still function, you can talk to your staff, there's that kind of physical connection to your teams. When everybody goes remote, you lose that one fundamental way of communicating with your staff, your volunteers, and potentially your beneficiaries and supporters as well. And because of that increased risk, we've seen a kind of importance in making sure that people are aware of the ransomware guidance, which again we'll share after this. But ransomware has definitely been one of the big themes that we've seen throughout this year. That's kind of it for my kind of setting the scene of 2020. I did just see in the chat one question come up, which I'm very sorry for not qualifying at the beginning. NCSC is the National Cybersecurity Centre. So we are the government agency responsible for cybersecurity. We sit as part of GCHQ, and essentially it's our role to make sure that all organisations and members of the public have access to accessible, appropriate advice and guidance to help them protect themselves from cybercrime. And we also have a series of other functions, such as incident management in the event of a national cyber incident that's affecting kind of people on a national scale. So thank you very much for asking that question. Apologies for the acronyms all the way through so far. At that point, I'd like to kind of pass on to the panel. So if I can first turn to Alan, from the perspective of the Charity Commission this year, what's 2020 been like for you?
Well, what can I say? Unprecedented. I don't think anybody, well, again, we might come back to this later on, but I don't think anybody in the charity sector have ever experienced anything on the scale as to the harm to charities, the charitable services that charities offer, and of course the beneficiaries. So I think, like charities, the regulators had to run as fast as we can to keep up with the very quickly changing environment that we've been working in this year. Now, and I hope, and I speak more generally from a regulatory perspective, that people will have seen, and charities will have seen, that we have adjusted the sort of guides and approach that we take this year, because we appreciate the pressures that charities are under, and therefore hopefully have responded in a way that charities will find helpful. However, in terms of saying all of that, and building on the points you made, Cub, purely from the fraud and cyber perspective, and the cases that are coming across my desk, actually, yeah, I'd reinforce the message you make there. There's nothing new. There really is virtually nothing new. It's that hook around the scams, around COVID, that we're seeing time and time again, that these scammers and cyber criminals are using to sort of lure in and bring in potential victims. And people have to be aware of that. So in terms of how we've responded on the fraud and cyber side, again, we've put out a couple of regulatory alerts very early on in terms of the first lockdown period, and we have some information on our website around and access to webinars that charities would benefit from. And that really makes exactly that point. Nothing really has changed. And again, what we are seeing in terms of the individual cases, so you alluded to some of these things. I mean, phishing, of course. But yes, that probably the second most common form of cyber attack still is ransomware. And it will... it can have a far greater impact now. And that's what we're hearing from charities when they do report these ransomware and extortion attacks, because of the changing nature and the way in which charities are operating. So we recognize that this new working and control environment has implications that we have never had to deal with before. And one way, especially, I know we're going to look hopefully to the future as well. But these new working arrangements and the way in which we traditionally look at fraud, so what's driving people to commit fraud, all these factors have been manifestly increased. Sadly, for those being made redundant, who are in charities or are concerned about the work their ability to work elsewhere. The traditional ways, and other sectors see this all the time, and we're no different from that in charities. Well, these same pressures, these same drivers, these same motivations occur in charities. We've just probably never had to deal with it to anything like the same extent. And as you've alluded to already, as we see the way in which IT and digital is far more important and has accelerated in terms of how it's helping deliver charitable services. Are all charities as prepared with the sort of defences they need, given the way in which this has happened so quickly? So I do appreciate that many charities will have taken on risk when the first lockdown started, because they could see that these problems were there and they had to respond very quickly. But this is the new way of working, and we need to start reconsidering what those risks are and how much is still acceptable, and what we now need to do to mitigate the risks that we still intend to live with.
Thank you, Alan. Definitely. I think we'll probably come back to that question of what people do with the risks that they've taken on in the future as we kind of begin to talk about next year as well. If I can next turn to Juliet. So obviously Marie Curie has been on the front lines of COVID, as an end-of-life charity, more broadly, just within health and social care. There is probably few charities that have been, as affected as that part of the voluntary sector. Could you reflect a little bit on what it's been like for Marie Curie this year?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd have to echo what Alan's just said, that it's been absolutely unprecedented this year. It's been incredibly busy for us all. And I'm happy to say our nurses have been able to carry on providing their services. Our hospices have stayed open. The nurses have been able to carry on doing their work. The challenge there has actually been getting PPE, so sourcing it and getting a good solid supply chain. And some of the logistics around delivery have been really tough and have taken a while to sort of crack that nut. But I think we've managed to do that now. In terms of the back office, we already had a strategy to start working more from home. So we also had a lot of staff who had laptops, so that was relatively seamless to actually make the shift to working from home. It went okay. It was fairly painless, I would say. We had a sort of the technology was there. From our point of view as the information governance and security team, there was a lot of work to be done around, as you said, Cub, with the education piece, the education awareness piece around securing routers and working securely in that way. We've also had to be really agile in the way we responded and to define new processes at speed. So for the furloughed staff as well, we had to make sure we got the access control just right. And that was a huge piece of work for us to make sure we disabled their access and disabled admin access as well. So we've done a lot around that and looking for those, making sure we've got the right controls in place. We had already a digital innovation sort of strategy that was just kind of in early stages, and that's now been accelerated. So we're looking at, like you say, new ways of working and the new normal and the implications of what that's going to look like. Delivering services to our patients, for example, virtual consultations. So we've had some interesting points around some of the virtual consultation, video conferencing services that enable those virtual consultations have been approved by the NHS for use, while we have to make sure ourselves that they meet our own standards for Marie Curie standards. So there's a sort of inherent tension there, because the clinicians need to get on with their primary work of providing care to patients, whereas we have to try and slow things down a bit, but not too much, and make sure they can, we can find a balance between security and safety. So yeah, overall busy and interesting and challenging.
Definitely, it's just reflecting on your last point. It's a very fine line to walk between, getting things out there and getting moving, and then doing the right thing when it comes to information governance. If I could next turn to Mia, please. So Mia, from the perspective of Fraud Advisory Panel, obviously an organisation advising others on fraud prevention as well. What's 2020 been like for your organisation?
Well, firstly, I'd have to say that I echo everything that's already been said. I think for anybody working in any sector or business at the moment, it has definitely been a year of unprecedented change and demand. And just like everybody else, we had to rapidly shift all our activities online. We had to adapt our systems and processes to respond to remote working. And while we're fortunate enough to be quite agile to be able to do that, I mean, we are a team of 2, so we're a very small organisation. It still also actually created challenges for us as an organisation in the practical sense, but also from a fraud risk management perspective too. So some of the things that we've had to think about, particularly when we first moved to home working, were things like how do we encourage our members not to send checks to our empty offices to pay their subscriptions? Sounds really basic, and in a normal world it wouldn't be a problem, but what's going to happen when we're not there to open it and we don't know if it's being, opened by somebody else, or even if it's just not arriving at the desk? And how are we going to monitor our post more generally? And other things like how do we move from having paper-based bank statements to electronic ones? What sort of changes do we need to make to our approvals systems for expenses to make sure that, we can authorize them electronically, but we can also have an audit trail that can be reviewed at a later date? And also sort of what other changes do we need to make to our systems and our processes and to our policies to make our obviously very small team make sure that they've got the right equipment and the tools and support that they can need to be able to do their jobs properly and to do them safely and securely as well. So there's sort of some of the things that we've had to grapple with as a smaller organisation. And while we were sort of grappling with them, we also appreciate that many others were too. So, and we also knew that fraudsters who thrive on this sort of uncertainty and confusion would also be looking to adapt their approach to try and take advantage of this new way of living and working. So one of the things that we did quite early on in the piece is we set up something called a COVID-19 Fraud Watch group, and that ran for 6 months until the end of September. And it was essentially designed to be a bit of an emergency response to what we thought might be a bit of a wave of fraud that might come out of the pandemic. And that group originally met every week, and then as we went through sort of the first lockdown and out of it, it sort of met more infrequently, met every fortnightly. And the whole rationale behind it really was to allow a broad range of organisations to come together, share information about current and emerging threats that they were seeing, and some of the practical tips and tools that could protect other organisations from those. And what we'd do is we'd collate all that information in quite a rapid fire way, and we'd return that back out as a summary that could be cascaded through the organisation's networks who were involved. And that did include the Charity Commission as well, and Alan sat on that group as well. And all those summaries are actually available on our website for anybody who's interested in taking a look at those. They're very short. They really just highlight some of the key risks that everybody was saying on the calls. And if anybody had any practical preventative guidance that they were prepared to share, that was included in it too. And from our perspective, what we really found during the course of those calls was really much what you've already said yourself and Alan, is that a lot of the frauds have really just been variations of existing frauds wrapped up in a bit of a COVID-19 camouflage or disguise. And I always liken it, when I was at university, I worked in retail to earn a little bit of money, and I kind of liken it to a storefront, and the fact that just as a retailer on the high street will change their window displays regularly to make their stock look attractive, it's kind of what fraudsters do. They just change it to try and lure more victims in, to make it resonate with what's happening in the wider world and what people want. So in terms of consumer frauds, 2 notable threats that we saw increase steadily throughout the pandemic were online shopping frauds and also investment frauds. And also over the past few months, there's been quite a lot of work around trying to combat courier fraud, which sometimes targets elderly or vulnerable people in their homes. And essentially that's where a person might receive a phone call, either from somebody who's claiming to be from their bank, or maybe even a police officer, who says that they've found or spotted some sort of fraudulent activity on their account or their card, and that a courier needs to come around and collect it from them. And so that's one thing that there's been a lot of work to try and combat, and obviously it's a type of fraud that can actually hurt people quite badly. And one of the other things that sort of come to light as well through the group, and was mentioned sort of during the early part of the lockdown, was also some instances of bereavement scams affecting families who were organising funerals. And that could be from somebody purporting to be from their bereavement services team, asking for credit card details in order to pay the funeral director. And there were other variations of that as well. And that was something that Trading Standards was working quite hard to try and raise awareness of. Given that happened during the first lockdown, and with the sort of increase that we've seen in deaths over the last couple of weeks as well, I guess there's a potential risk that we might start to see some of those scams come to light again now as well. And obviously for charities who support people in the community, or those who might be in financial, psychological or emotional distress, it's important to be aware of these scams, because you might find people coming to you who have actually suffered these. And in terms of online shopping frauds, really that's probably more of a result of our change to our shopping habits than anything else. And initially, a lot of those have, and it's already been mentioned, were related to sort of fake medical goods, PPE, face masks and the like. And that sort of shifted over the past few months to focus more on cars and pets, as people wanted company when they're at home and the like. And again, I would imagine that will shift again as we continue to go through this. The recent announcements about vaccines will probably mean that we will begin to see maybe some more fake advertisements for vaccines being publicised as well. In terms of common risk to businesses and charities, as has already been mentioned by others, we haven't really seen anything that's changed terribly much over the past few months. And we haven't really seen any large increase in fraud per se. Some organisations have told us that they saw a dip during the initial start of the pandemic, and that's begun to increase back to normal levels. And, a lot of the risks Covers already touched upon, and so has Alan, in terms of phishing and ransomware and the like. And I would probably just add to that maybe payment diversion and procurement frauds, CEO and business impersonation fraud, and obviously insider fraud as well, just because insider fraud tends to be a relatively constant threat to any organisation. And that's really why it's important to make sure that you do due diligence in these areas and to be aware of the risks. Cub, back over to you.
Thanks very much, Mia. And I saw a couple of questions coming in as you were talking, asking if they can have the link to your COVID fraud hub on the website. So we will make sure that all of those links about anything that we talk about today go out with the recording of the webinar later on. So please do check back for those links. I think a lot of small charities, Mia, will probably have gone through very similar challenges at the beginning of all of this. Particularly in kind of the way you had to adapt, and even just considering the way that you had to get your post. It's not really something even I'd considered myself, but without those membership fees, you as a charity can't operate. So eminently important. I think that's probably all we'll touch on in terms of 2020. I imagine some of those themes will come up as we begin to talk about 2021 as well. But I think everybody here, and I'm sure listening at home, is sitting hoping that 2021 will be a better year than we've had this year. I know the immediate consideration is how is Christmas going to go, but once we get past that, we're certainly going to be looking to what 2021 holds. I'd like to kind of ask the panel to reflect a little bit on what they see as being likely in 2021, how they see it affecting their organisations, and for those that are able to comment, the wider sector as well. So if I can first turn to Juliet, obviously, as we said a second ago, you've been on the front lines of the response to COVID. It's taken quite a toll on Marie Curie in terms of the resource you've had to put into that response. How do you see things looking next year for Marie Curie and the way that you deliver your service?
Well, there's going to be a continued sort of environment of uncertainty, and that's just not going to change, and that will affect the way we approach our work. So we'll have an agile strategy anyway. We've been rolling out, for examples of agile training across the charity so that we have more people who can use that approach across the charity with their own roles. So that will mean, I think, lots of trying things out, which of course comes with a certain level of risk and having to prioritize. So there are certainly challenges around how we're going to prioritize. I think we'll see more continued working from home, and we're just beginning to see that people are asking to work from abroad, for example. So those requests come to our team to review. So that's a whole new set of challenges around assessing, for example, the encryption laws in the countries they want to go and work in, so that we can make sure that their laptops, for example, won't be seized at the airport. So that's an interesting direction. I expect it to move further in that direction as people want the flexibility with the working from home. I'd say I touched earlier on our digital innovation strategy, that I think there'll be more roles created in that area, so that what we provide is well resourced and highly relevant. New technologies are fundraising. We've been unable to carry out face-to-face fundraising, which we've taken quite a hit from. So fundraising will move to new platforms online. So cloud, there'll be more, I anticipate more and more use of different cloud services. So also things like QR codes. So the work for our team will also move towards helping fundraising as much as we can, supporting them with new standards, for example, so they can have a toolkit which can help them move at pace, and we'll have a set of approved suppliers, approved products, and so on, so that they don't have to come to us with every new thing that, every new initiative they want to do. They can just use that sort of playbook that we provided them with. So that's a change I'm expecting for next year. Also, we as a charity, in terms of the care we provide to patients, we're moving to what we call place-based care, which is about collaborations in different communities. So we'll collaborate with all the local care providers in different areas so that we can understand the needs, which will vary per area. So there'll be a lot of us sharing our data with third parties and them sharing their data with us. So there's lots of governance around that and getting the right sort of data sharing agreements in place. So I expect to see more of that, more requirements to work with devices in a flexible way. So more using tablets and so on to provide care to patients, to take the notes. And I would also, I think my final point would be a huge and ongoing education and awareness piece across the charity to make sure that people are only using the services that we as a team have endorsed and approved, to minimise the risks and to prevent the use of shadow IT creeping in, because people, if they don't have the right tools available to them or they're not aware of what they actually are, then they can naturally move to use their own solutions, which is a situation we want to avoid. So I'd say that's how the next year is looking for me.
Thank you, Julia. It's very interesting, your point about travelling abroad. I think previously people wouldn't even think of taking their work IT abroad with them. If you're going on a week's holiday, you're on a week's holiday. But I think that risk of quarantine potentially at either end has led to a lot more people, I think, going, well, I will just take my work phone or my work laptop just to be on the safe side in case I get stuck in self-isolation or something while away. We've noticed that cropping up in a lot of the conversations we've had with charities recently. I think if I can probably just reflect on a couple of points there. From NCSE's perspective, in kind of 2021, we see a lot of organizations who, you know, will have made those quite quick decisions of going to a virtual way of operating during 2020. What we're encouraging now is that kind of going back and looking over those decisions with fresh eyes, with a slightly less rushed approach, and working out how to set up those longer term solutions. I think similarly to how Marie Curie are looking at all the different pieces of technology and tools that they provide to make sure that actually, you know, shadow IT doesn't creep in the way that I know for a lot of organizations it has, and making sure that your staff actually have the tools that are, you know, will allow them to do the work. The reason people go and, you know, take out shadow IT, we've found is not because they just are a massive fan of a particular brand. It's because that piece of software or tool works for their job and they're purely just trying to get their job done. So we're certainly encouraging through the physical to digital guidance and more broadly through our portfolio to encourage organizations to take an approach, you know, like Marie Curie's, that's in consultation with staff, with your volunteers, even with your board as well, to make sure that actually you're providing the tools that will work to do the job, and that they don't kind of need to bring in that level of you know, IT without telling you, which can always be the most frustrating thing. But I think in terms of overall, cybercrime itself hasn't really changed in the last 5 years. You know, phishing was a big risk 5 years ago. It's still a big risk now. Ransomware was around 5 years ago. It's still around today. Cyber criminals aren't fundamentally changing the way that they're operating. And I think both Alan and Mia have reflected on this. They're just changing the hook in which they're using to, you know, carry out those criminal activities in quite an opportunistic way. And I think, you know, that is fundamentally the way that most criminals will operate in terms of taking opportunities when they arise. We know that, you know, you see an increase in your personal life offers of a tax refund from HMRC around the time that people would expect tax refunds to come in. They're not, you know, stupid. They do play off real-time scenarios. We saw it around, you know, big sporting events. You see more crimes related to those sporting events because there's more interest in it. So what I think we will see in 2021, and I think Mia alluded to this earlier around vaccine frauds, is a lot more sort of phishing and cybercrime linked to circumstances at the time and events at that point in time, such as the rollout of the vaccine, such as you know, the availability or people trying to sell you know, vaccines, obviously not the ones provided by the NHS. So I think we see that continuing to happen through 2021. But I think the big shift that we'll see, which I think has happened in dribs and drabs, and as I said before, in a slightly sort of rushed way in some senses, is a much more sort of rounded move to cloud-based solutions. I think a lot of organizations have been slowly transitioning away from more traditional delivery of IT infrastructure towards the cloud, but they've been doing it a little bit at a time, building up that trust in the platforms. I think most organizations will probably appreciate now that their cloud-based solutions gave them a lot of flexibility through lockdown. And while, you know, touch wood, we don't hope that ever happens again in terms of, you know, a pandemic such as this, it has allowed organizations a flexibility that I think they will miss if they go back to the old ways of working. So we expect to see, and will provide guidance for, a lot more organizations moving to cloud as being the basis for their IT infrastructure. But with that also comes risks, and I think it'd probably be remiss to not mention the biggest incident that's occurred over COVID, affecting, you know, I think over 100 charities in the UK, which is the attack that happened to Blackboard, which are a cloud software provider based in the US, but with a lot of UK customers, where a significant amount of data held on their servers was taken by a criminal group. Blackboard paid the ransom in exchange for proof that they had deleted that data, but unfortunately it's led to a number of UK charities also needing to report to the Charity Commission, to the Information Commissioner's Office, and obviously alert their supporters, beneficiary staff, whoever it might be in that data. And those cases do happen. Thankfully, they are incredibly rare. And I think the crux of what I would just say around that, in case it comes up in the Q&A later, is those organisations on the whole are investing a significantly larger amount of money and time and resource into the security of their services than any small, medium, or even large charity would be able to match. And as a result, on the whole, they are far more secure and allow you to focus your time on the actions that will improve your individual security rather than worrying about the security of your whole infrastructure. You can trust your cloud supplier with good due diligence and procurement processes to actually do a lot of that security for you of the data, and you just make sure that you're keeping up your end of that contract with them. So be a little remiss not to have mentioned that, but I think that generally we will see that move to the cloud over this next year. If I can turn at this point to Mia, so I think from what we've seen in the news and what going out across sector press at the moment, there is a likelihood that there will be some perhaps even significant levels of redundancies and loss of staff in the voluntary sector over the next year or so. Do you think this will have an effect on the types of fraud we're seeing in charities or affecting charities in 2021?
Thanks, Cav. I think absolutely it will have an impact on potential risks of fraud within organisations, particularly if the organisation doesn't have the right safeguards in place to manage actually the risk of fraud and the loss of staff as well. And I appreciate that could be really challenging in the current environment, but some of the things that need to be looked or considered is, what do you do about getting the safe return of equipment from staff and stopping access to your computer networks and other systems, especially if they're still working from home and you've just made them redundant. And there's also a risk that some of their responsibilities may fall through the cracks as people leave the organisation if nobody picks up those responsibilities. And again, that can just increase the vulnerability of the organisation, because it could be that unless you understand what their job entails and what actually they're doing on a day-to-day basis, it could very well be that something that is a very good safeguard to your organisation might be missed. And again, that just opens up a larger vulnerability to you. One of the other things that has often also happens, and it sort of happened a little bit in the last recession as well, is that, there's a chance that existing frauds that may have been going on for quite some time will begin to come to light in the next weeks or months ahead, partly as staff come off furlough or begin to return to their offices, as more job losses are announced and budgets continue to constrict, as organisations begin to review the processes that they may have introduced at the start of the crisis to see if they're still fit for purpose. All these things can mean that, frauds that may have been going on for some time begin to become uncovered. And of course, that then needs to be addressed as well. And so we always say it's really useful to have some sort of plan already in place, so that if you do come across something that looks like fraud and you need to take action, at least you have a bit of a response plan about what you're going to do. And that may very well be that you consult external experts, but being prepared for that inevitability or possibility is really, really important. Broadly speaking, though, and it basically echoes what you've already just said, in terms of fraud and cybercrime, we think 2021 will really bring more of the same. And we did a short straw poll really of members of the COVID-19 Fraud Watch group over the summer to say what they thought they might see in the next sort of 6 months or so. And what they told us is that they reckon the biggest risks to organisations will be insider fraud, followed by cyber type incidents like viruses, malware, spyware and the like, and also financial investment fraud as well. And, with staff under strain, sometimes it might be that they only see fraud as the only option or the only way out. And that's just something we all need to just be aware of. And, one thing we could do or start to consider is whether or not there's any additional support that we can provide to our staff who might find themselves in need, whether or not that's providing signposting to other relevant organisations or support services that can help them too, so that they feel that we're supporting them as well. From a consumer perspective, again, we'll probably just see variations of shopping frauds, online shopping frauds, and as I've mentioned, and you've mentioned, some of them will undoubtedly be linked probably to the new vaccines and the like. And we'll probably also see a bit more of investment fraud as well, because with people under sort of financial strain, they may look for other opportunities to raise money as well. So that's just another area that we probably need to really consider. It's really interesting because the ACFE, which is an organisation that represents counter-fraud professionals globally, they did a survey recently, and amongst their professionals, they estimated that they expected to see an increase in fraud over the next year, and that was by almost 93% of their members. So I think there will be an increase. That's not necessarily means that it's all going to be new fraud. It could just be potentially fraud that was already there that we've just become aware of. Cap.
Thank you very much, Mia. I think, as you say, I mean, I've certainly been teeing up my things that I'm going to buy in the Black Friday sales, so I've been very conscious of that online shopping side of things, but I hope that everyone else on the call will be as well. Alan, to turn to you, I think for the last point before we move to the questions, I think everybody's mentioned how they think these changes we've seen in 2020 will pretty much make up the new way of working, as it were. Are these risks likely to be, the risks associated with that likely to be different depending on the size of your charities, or are these kind of risks universal?
Well, it's a bit of a mix, to be honest. I mean, I think let's start before the whole COVID pandemic hit us as a sector. And I think we probably all recognize that the way in which smaller or micro charities respond to the fraud and cyber risks was almost inevitably going to be different than it would be for the larger charities. And there's a variety of reasons for this, resources being a major part of that. I mean, that's why it's so encouraging when you hear Juliette speaking about Marie Curie. And I love that phrase, that the playbook, they've got a playbook and they're ready and prepared and considering the risks and taking these forward. Now that's great. That's so encouraging, and I'm hopeful that other charities, especially larger charities, will be taking a similar approach. I wouldn't be surprised at all. But if you're a small charity and you've only got a couple of, maybe you have one member of staff, if that, might be volunteers, really trustees. We've always recognized that the resources that they can draw upon, the expertise that's available to them is completely different, and therefore their response is completely different. Now you put ourselves in the situation where we are at present, and all that's magnified. So that doesn't mean that small charities, I'm sure we'll come to some guidance that we both would endorse, that we specific for small charities. But that doesn't mean they can't take appropriate action. But I think we have to be realistic and say, actually, potentially the threat could be greater simply because of the environment in which the smaller charities inevitably have to work. Segregation of duties controls that we would see in larger charities, people checking and double checking, as it were, and across a number of different ways in which those controls would operate. I mean, they were always a problem at smaller charities anyway. You threw in this issue about we're now completely separated in terms of working from home. You throw in issues around, especially with smaller charities, will they have the resources to keep their software updated, patched, the temptation to bring your own devices, all the things that Juliette mentioned about Marie Curie, but magnify those risks simply because of the environment they work in. I was just looking back at some of our research that we published last year, preventing charity fraud and preventing charity cybercrime, and what I noticed, and this is before the COVID scam, COVID pandemic and the related scams, was actually when you asked charities themselves, how aware are you of the risk of cybercrime? Though there was an increasing awareness of those risks, and that was so encouraging. What actually we found was that smaller charities themselves were quite frank about the fact that they really were not as engaged in fully understanding the risks that they face as generally larger charities would do. And that is, as I say, it's all but inevitable. That's why it's so encouraging when you hear organizations like the Small Charities Coalition or the Foundation for Social Improvement, who represent smaller charities, really engaging as they have with the Charity Commission and other partners such as yourself to help smaller charities appreciate their risks. I was struck though by one specific piece of research. I'll just quote one of the findings, and that found that one of the questions we asked charities about cybercrime was the obvious in some ways. Do you know what type of cyber crime, cyber attacks you're most vulnerable to? And nearly 40% of charities turned around and said they did not. Well, the first way of making yourself more resilient is to appreciate your risks. And that's why I'm sure when we start to provide the links to the guidance that's out there, and and again, reflecting on what particularly Mia said about what the fraud advisory panel have published about understand those risks, it's being able to share that information from other sectors, apply it to the charity sector, and really getting some champions within particularly smaller charities and individual champions at individual smaller charities to take more of a lead, an active lead, a proactive lead in terms of helping their own charities become more resilient. So I don't for 1 minute fail to appreciate that smaller charities potentially have, the greater, the bigger mountain to climb simply because of the resources that they have at their disposal.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think we would absolutely echo your position there on sort of how small charities appreciate those risks and manage them with the limited resources they will have available at any one time. Given the time, I'm going to turn to the Q&A at this point. I can see we've got 12 questions currently come in. Apologies if it looks like I'm currently pointing at you all. It's just that I'm doing this on my iPad, and to see the Q&A, I've got to do it with my hands. The first one is actually a two-part question, which I'm grateful that I can probably answer in one part, but it's definitely to the NCSE, this question. So it's from Deborah. Are the NCSE's Cyber Essentials a legal minimum standard, as Steve Eckersley, the ICO Director of Investigations, has says? So I can say with certainty that Cyber Essentials is not a legal requirement for all organisations. I'm not quite sure that the comments that Steve Eckersley's made that have perhaps alluded to that, but Cyber Essentials is it's a cyber standard. It's being created by the NCSE with the support of other government departments such as Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport and others, which essentially takes organisations through a framework that allows them to assess their cybersecurity against the standard. And there are two levels, the first of which is self-certified, which is then checked off by a certification body to make sure that the answers they've given do chime with the framework, and you get Cyber Essentials with that. And then you've got Cyber Essentials Plus, which is then independently verified. So someone will do those checks on your system to make sure that they are configured in the best way and in line with the framework. But it's not a legal minimum standard at this point. I don't know if there is some work underway to make it so. I haven't heard of that underway myself. But I know that certainly in some procurement contracts, particularly for government contracts, they've made it a minimum requirement to be able to get that contract. So if you're dealing with large amounts of data on individuals, for example, on behalf of government, those contracts quite often make that a requirement of the contract for it to be awarded to you. If I can, and if Mimi's able to, I'll put my email in the chat. If you are able to send me the bit that alludes to that being the case, I'd be very grateful. I'm going to go on to the next question from there, but I'm happy to answer that further offline afterwards. And ask the next one, which is how much importance should a charity give to get themselves accredited with Cyber Essentials Plus? Or is this just another badge you can display? If I could turn first off to Julia as a large charity who will have gone through various frameworks, just to give your perspective initially just on kind of certification schemes as a whole and how you use them within Marie Curie, if that's possible. Yep,
sure. I mean, I think in principle they're an excellent idea. I think Cyber Essentials it's a really good foundation set of principles to adhere to. I mean, if you are a smaller charity and you lack resources to actually go ahead, there's the basics version, not the plus version. So you can do a self-assessment, and that's a really good starting point. So I'd recommend, even if you're just sort of moving in the right direction and you don't necessarily get accredited by a third party with Cyber Essentials Plus, that's still a really good move. So yeah, I think definitely go in that direction. It sort of depends on who you're providing services to. I'd be quite led by that as well. So if people that you want to provide services to are saying that you must be accredited, then move in that direction. Then yeah. So
Absolutely.
A good thing.
Yeah, I think that very much reflects our view in that, Cyber Essentials, we've written the standard, we've helped develop it. We know it's not going to be suitable for everybody. We want to get as many organisations onto the standard as we can, but that actually it's about whether it's right for your organisation, and for some, they won't need to go through the full certification, but actually using the framework to help you make sure that you are in line with good practice is a really sensible step to take to improve your cybersecurity. Unless Alan and Mia want to jump in particularly on that one, I'll take the next question. So I'm actually just going to skip down a little bit to one on bring your own device from Matthew. So Matthew says, we've been open to bring your own device this year, but during lockdown they've been open to it. But their view is that changing that we think more control rather than less is probably going to be more effective to ensure security, monitoring policy adherence, etc. Not least because we have a small number of technology staff available to them. And what views does the panel have, and what patterns are you seeing in the sector? If I can first go to Alan to give his views on that one, I'd be most grateful from the regulator's perspective. Oh, you're still muted, Alan.
Right, thanks, Gub. Yes, I mean, I certainly recognise, and I'm sure it resonates with many, the comment that was just in the question, the elements of that question, because you're right. And I sort of referred to this a little bit in my earlier answer about smaller charities in particular, but not limited to. So yeah, I think we recognise that this is going to be something that's increasingly happening. Certainly when I talk to other charities, that I see this time and again as an issue for them. So our approach has been, and is really to direct charities towards the guidance that National Cybersecurity Centre put out on bring your own devices. It's a great piece of guidance. But having said all of that, some charities will inevitably go down a route where they could open themselves up to risk. But at least I would encourage them to look at the good practice that's out there and to make themselves as resilient as possible.
Thank you. And Mia, being a relatively small charity who's had to rely on perhaps bringing your own device to certain things, and at the beginning, people were having to use different devices to be able to get onto different conferencing platforms because their corporate IT prevented it. How have you handled bring your own device, and do you see that being the way you'll operate in the future?
Well, to some extent, we've been quite fortunate because we did have full kit that we could take home. But like you said, as a small charity, we have had to use some of our devices, and we're actually at a point now where we're reviewing that and actually making sure that it's safe for us to continue to do that. So, I think obviously it's a question for each individual organisation. From our perspective, I think we would prefer to keep ourselves on our corporate devices as much as possible, and purely because we know that it's got everything it needs to keep us safe. And while we had to shift slightly at the beginning, that's certainly something that we are reviewing as an organisation ourselves now to see if we can bring it all within that corporate umbrella.
Brilliant. And I think, Alan probably alluded to the NCSE position before. We've got guidance on bring your own device, which we'll make sure the links are available to afterwards. I think from my perspective in talking to charities, as organisations move to the cloud increasingly, the need for corporately provided laptops may change. You can access a lot of those devices, a lot of those services perfectly securely from your own device, but making sure that you've got good authentication to your cloud provided services from those devices is really important, and understanding what technology your staff and volunteers are going to want to use to access those services is also really important. So I'll make sure we make that guidance available afterwards.
Campbell, if I can just the sort of a related issue. The other thing we did see a lot of reports on at the early stages of the first lockdown was actually charities saying that some of their video conferencing had been in one way or another accessed by individuals that should not. Now, what is encouraging is that I know through yourselves, we pointed people in the direction of guidance that NCSC put out about securing video conferencing more effectively. And what the positive I take out of this is actually once people are aware of, one, the risk, and two, the good practice. Actually, we've virtually had no similar reports in recent months. So it does look to me that as charities appreciate those risks, and you keep putting out, as other organizations do, that sort of good practice, they are being taken on board. It's just, I would just always say, as we see new risks emerge, start to think how these could be abused if you're not careful, just to stay a little bit ahead of the game as best we can against these cyber criminals.
Definitely. Completely. And as we see those things occurring and as we're made available, please don't ever think we've seen something. If you want to make it NCSC aware of it, please do. We've got various social media accounts, and I think my email's been put in the chat. I'm very happy for you to come direct to me, and we will work with the Commission, with Charities and others to make that guidance available, including through Charities Digital and their news site as well. So given the time, I'm just going to take two last questions, one which I'll just answer myself very quickly, which is what specific steps should we take to protect against ransomware? And then the second question, which I'll pose to our panel now, just so they can be thinking about, if you could leave everybody today with one thing you'd like to point them to, what would that be? And I'll turn to you all each in a second. Just going back to the ransomware question, we've got some really, really good guidance around ransomware available on the website, which again we'll link to in a second. But the two things I would highlight from that, the first of which is make sure all of your systems are up to date. So making sure you've got a really robust patching schedule, that you're getting things in terms of updates to your systems, to software, to devices as soon as possible, and that any that you're delaying, you're constantly reviewing the risk of that patch being delayed. I always hark back to WannaCry. It feels like quite an old example now, but in 2017, that patch for Windows had been available for 56 days before the WannaCry attack actually gained any traction. So it's quite a while, and all of those organizations, if they deployed that patch, would have been far better protected. And the second thing I would say is make sure that you have really good and tested backups, so that you've tried to recover from those backups on your systems. Because if you do suffer a ransomware, yes, it's annoying. Yes, it's very frustrating. Yes, you may have to, report to policing, perhaps the ICO, if your systems were compromised. But if you've got backups, you can recover much, much more quickly. And actually, avoid paying the ransom. I know most charities aren't willing to pay ransoms. It goes against, their values and their ethics as an organisation. So that backup will just allow you to restore. You might lose a day or two, but actually, if you've got good tested backups, you'll be able to recover really well from a ransomware. So I'm going to go back to that question I posed a second ago to finish us off today before we close. Which is, if you could leave people today with one thing, what would you leave them with? We'll go first to Alan, if that's okay.
Thanks, Gob. I think I would be remiss if I did not recommend that for everybody, whether you are a large or a small charity or just an individual, have a look at the Cybersecurity Small Charity Guide that NCSC puts out, and we at the Charity Commission fully supported and promoted. That was written about 3 years ago now, I'm thinking well before the current COVID crisis. Now, I looked at it again this morning, just in anticipation of this discussion, and have been happily surprised about how basically nothing has changed in terms of the relevance of that guidance. So I would encourage everybody, not just at your charity, but to share with volunteers and employees and trustees that guide. It's as relevant now as it was 3 years ago.
Thank you, Alan. I would definitely echo your comments there. If I can go to Mia for your one thing, please.
Sure. And I would recommend that everybody take a look at the Charity Fraud Awareness Hub that has been available for the last year and a half, I feel, about now. And that contains a whole range of really useful and practical tools for charities of all sizes. Includes help sheets, practical tutorials on things like how to spot a CEO fraud, webinars, lots of really good information. It's available at least until the end of the year, hopefully longer. Take a look. You can access that both through the Charity Commission website and from ours.
Thank you, Mia. And finally, if I can turn to you, Juliet, for your one thing you'd like to leave people with today.
Yes, I'd point people towards the NCSC website. There's also lots of good guidance on there. But I'd also say the cyber, if you want to focus on one thing each year, then the October Cyber Security Aware Month is a really good one, because they do provide some very simple messages, so key messages that people can take away to avoid sort of over complexity. And if I can just get ever such a quick plug in for Mary Curie, Cobb, just for anybody that is caring for or supporting someone with terminal illness, then we do have an information and support line. So I'd direct anybody towards that. That's open 6 days a week and staffed by our professionals. So that's always a good resource.
Thank you. A very worthy plug, I think, to finish us off. And then I will, without meaning to finish on a slightly negative note, if anybody does suffer a cybercrime or a fraud, I just want to make sure you know where to report that to as my kind of final parting piece. So if you do fall victim, you can report to policing through the Action Fraud website, or they do have a phone number there if you prefer to speak to someone over the phone to do it. That will go into a police triaging, and that's for any cybercrime, live cyber attack, or fraud. You can report those through Action Fraud. You may also need, depending on what it is, to also report to the regulators, so the Charity Commission, Serious Incident Report, the Information Commissioner, if it involves people's personal data and their rights and freedoms are likely to have been infringed by it. And then should you receive one of those ghastly phishing emails that we've alluded to so many times today, you can now forward those to the NCSC. So you just send them to report@phishing.gov.uk, and we will analyse them, look at the links, see if there's anything malicious in there. And if there is, we will then work to get that site taken down and that scam taken off the internet, which will obviously in turn help to protect other people, organisations, and hopefully mean that less people fall victim. It's been a really heartwarming how much response we've had to that so far since we launched it at the beginning of lockdown. So please do continue to use it. And with that, it really falls on me to say thank you very much to our panel, Alan, Mia, Juliet, for joining us today. And we hope that this session has been very useful. The recording will be available after the session. It just takes a little bit of time just to make sure we get it onto the site, but that will be available soon. And any questions, I'm afraid there were quite a few that we didn't manage to get to answer in the time. We will try and make sure that the guidance that we would have pointed to in those spaces is available on the website as well afterwards from any one of our 4 organisations. But with that, thank you very much. Have a nice rest of the year, everybody. And we look forward to welcoming you back in January.